Earlier this week, there was an announcement that came out, and it was pretty stunning because these things when these stories they sort of fade away. They've been around for so long, you kind of forget. But earlier this week, there was a startling announcement that a team of 40 former law enforcement folks had finally figured out who Zodiac was. And if you're of a certain vintage, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not, late 60s San Francisco area, there was a serial killer who called himself Zodiac, sent messages, sent puzzles, sent letters to newspapers, terrorized the San Francisco area. And there have been books about him and movies about him. You can find a movie, I don't know if it's on Netflix or anyway, it's around. All kinds of other streaming services as well. Anyway, they said they finally found who this guy was, put out a picture, put out his name, everything. Well, turns out that Gary Francis Post, who's an Air Force veteran who died in 2018, was their guy. They said it was him. So case closed. Except last night the FBI says, no. The case is still open. Post is not the killer. That's been disproven. He couldn't have done some of these. So what is going on? Well, to help answer that, I thought we would bring on a guy who some time ago did something absolutely remarkable related to this case. He helped to crack Zodiac's incredibly complicated cipher, a puzzle with symbols and things. And it contained a message no one else could figure out what it was. His name is David Aranchuk. He's a software developer and cipher expert. David, how are you today? Thanks for doing this.
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
So when you heard this, now you had worked on this, on figuring out this, and we'll call it a puzzle. It's a cipher, but for people who don't know, it's an incredibly complicated puzzle that required you guys to work with computers and programs and everything. When you heard the news this week that they had uncovered and unveiled Zodiac, were you excited or were you not buying it, or what were you thinking when you heard this?
Initially, I was fairly neutral on it because this kind of thing kind of happens all the time. Like every few years, there's some big announcement that someone has identified the killer, and a lot of times it's a family member. They point their finger at somebody in the family, a father or stepfather or something like that, and it'll receive some brief, intense media coverage, and then the analysis of their suspect eventually fades out because there's not a whole lot of strong evidence that can slam dunk prove that suspect is truly the killer. And so I've been used to that kind of playing out that way. And so as more details came out from this story, it became kind of clear to me that it was going to be another one of these types of stories where there's a lot of excitement because of the people involved. This team of 40 individuals is comprised of, former law enforcement, journalists, and people with good pedigrees. But the evidence that they've been putting out has been getting a lot of negative reactions. Like you mentioned, law enforcement has been pushing back on their claims. All of the jurisdictions involved with the Zodiac case have officially come out and said, the case is still open, and we're basically not going to comment any further. There's no, indications from law enforcement that they're seriously considering the suspect as being the killer.
So your work, and it was, what was it, about a year ago that you guys came out with, maybe it was more than a year ago now, that you came out with Breaking the Code. And again, people should go on YouTube and watch. It's a remarkable story. You can see how it was done, way more complicated than I have time, or even David has time to explain it right now. But watch the YouTube video. It's really, really well done. But even with the information that you were able to get out of that, is this now looking like one of these cases that the messages and the hints that he left is not going to necessarily lead to the killer, and it's going to have to work backwards, that if they finally ever can figure out who it is, maybe your message can then make more sense because now we'll know who the person is, and what they said would then bolster that?
Yeah, that's possible. That might actually help, and that's happened in the past where cases that have had cryptograms that were unsolved after they apprehended the suspect, for example, the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, he had produced or sent out a cipher that was unsolved until he had gotten arrested, and he helped law enforcement. He helped them figure out how to actually decrypt that message, and it was a little complicated, and he had made some mistakes, so that's why it was so hard to decrypt it. So that could very well be the case with some of these unsolved ciphers that are left on the Zodiac case. But there's a lot of things that can trap people up. Like with these ciphers, it's very easy to generate messages that aren't really there, and people have been doing that for many years, and I've seen thousands of attempts in those directions where people kind of get misguided. They see kind of the equivalent of a face in the clouds. When they're looking at the ciphers, they see all these symbols and they turn them into patterns. They start to see words and phrases. And so there's a danger of making something like that come out when it's not really there.
You obviously know this case exceedingly well. Do you believe that this person, whoever it is, whether it's this guy or not this guy, do you believe he's still alive? And the reason I ask is it seemed that when he was doing his work, and we'll call it work, there was a great need of his to be noticed and to be in the spotlight, not obviously by name, but for Zodiac to be noticed. And I wonder if he was still alive right now, if there would not have been some message or some way of reaching out to continue with that. I find it hard to believe that he would sit silent while all this was happening.
Yeah, and again, the BTK is another good example of that, because he did go silent for a long time, but then eventually felt that need to taunt the police and to taunt the victims again, and that's what ended up getting him caught. So if we had something like that come from the Zodiac killer, that would be, kind of a similar pattern. But we haven't, and maybe he lost interest, or maybe he died, or maybe he went to prison on some unrelated charge. So there's all these different reasons why we might not be hearing from him.
David, we're short on time, unfortunately, but I'd love for people to be able to see that YouTube video of how you cracked this code. It's a truly, truly fascinating story. I know it's had like 2 million hits already. What would people search under YouTube if they wanted to find that?
Just search for Let's Crack Zodiac, the 340 is solved.
There you go. When you have 10, well, it's more than that. It's about 25 or 30 minutes, I think, the video. Well worth your time, though. And David, thank you so much for taking a few minutes today and joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It is one of the ongoing mysteries. But if you want to see that about how you take a puzzle that is impossible to solve and solve it, that is the one.